Chapter 5 I Met a Lady. Hilda was sitting on the bottom stair, working at a wooden box, with hammer and screwdriver. The box was filled with tennis rackets, balls, and fishing tackle, and Hilda was very eager to get it open. She was attacking it as a boy might, a boy with good mechanical sense. She looked up and saw Crystal, outlined against the outer sunshine, with a basket in her hand. At first she thought it was Agnes Grant, and smiled a quick welcome. Crystal took a step forward with her basket. She was a little embarrassed, with shyness, and so began at the tail end of her greeting, instead of at the beginning. "Berries," she blurted, and then stuck for the next word. Hilda picked up her hammer impatiently. "Oh," she said, "thought you were someone else. Take the berries around to the back door, please. Bianca makes awful fusses about things brought to the front door." Bang, bang, bang went the hammer. Not looking at Crystal again, Hilda braced her knee against the box to get a good purchase before beginning to pull off the top boards. Crystal stood for an instant, taking in what had happened. Then she whirled and stepped back out of the hospitable door that had so betrayed her. At the same time, she heard another voice, it must be Paul's, from a corner of the hall, raised above the hammer strokes. Say, that was the Larkspur girl, not the grocer. The hammer stopped, and Hilda exclaimed, "Bother, I'm an idiot." But Crystal, although she had heard, did not turn around. Neither did she start off down the drive. That would keep her in sight too long. She would get away quickly around the house, home by way of the fields. She had just turned the corner when she heard Hilda, now at the front door, calling apologetically, "Crystal, oh Crystal." But she did not turn back. She hurried on. In a minute she was around the second corner, and about to dash past the back door. The back door had one step and a wide veranda. On that step Hebe sat shelling peas in the shade of the house. At least she had been shelling peas. At the minute of Crystal's discovering her, she was merely idle, her hands resting on the sides of the bright pan in her lap, her head tipped back against the piazza post, her eyes wide open and gazing straight out across the meadows to the woods beyond. Most people, so idle and unconscious of observation, would sit sagged, relaxed. Even in her present mood of hurt pride and confusion, Crystal noticed how Hebe sat, differently from anyone else, still unmoving. Even so, it was as though she were dancing. A breath of wind might blow her, bend her, the way it does a grass. She was so lightly poised. She was dressed in white, a very soft, dull white, perhaps more ivory. The frock was cut in a V at the neck, and had no decoration, except its long sleeves, tied at the wrist with bits of pearly ribbon. In a season when most frocks were practically sleeveless, Crystal was struck by these sleeves, and could not help thinking about them. She came to a dead stop, and was surveying Hebe, who seemed unconscious of her presence. As she stood, her cheeks cooled, and her heart steadied down in its beating. She forgot Hilda and her amazing rudeness. Then slowly, perhaps, she had been aware of her all the while. Hebe turned her head, and, unstartled, her eyes met Crystal's. But there was a pause before she spoke, and she did not lift her hands from their resting on the pan in her lap. Lightly, in a tone that matched her posture, she said, "Oh, it is you. Good morning." Crystal glanced down at the basket of berries in her hand, as at an excuse for her intrusion. With Hebe she knew no embarrassment, and there was no danger of sentences coming wrong in too. Hebe waited for sentences. "These are berries from our garden." Crystal gave the explanation of her presence here. Selina thought it would be nice to bring them up to Hilda as a present, but Hilda told me Bianca wanted things delivered at the back door. Hebe's straight dark brows drew together. In tranquillity they were delicate and nicely drawn, but not noticeable in any way. Drawn like this together, you became sharply aware of them. "Hilda sent you around to the back door with your present." The voice still kept its own peculiar quality of lightness, but it was star-frosty with displeasure. In justice to Hilda, how heart-breaking it would be to have Hebe direct such a tone against oneself. Crystal said quickly, "Oh, she couldn't see me very well in the door that way. She called to me when she did see, only I couldn't go back, I couldn't. Do you mind taking them, giving them to her?" Hebe's brows relaxed. "No, of course. Hilda was simply thoughtless," she said, "but you must like each other and be friends this summer. Yes, certainly, I will give them to her from you. What gorgeous berries they are, and what a nice way to keep them cool in leaves. Put them down here. Let's each have one." Bianca, hearing voices, had come to the kitchen door. Hebe held one of the berries out to her. "A strawberry, Bianca," she said. "They are for Hilda, but you may have one. Hilda won't mind." Bianca refused the strawberry, but took the basket. "Put them in a silver dish. Don't you think they will be nice in the round silver dish we discovered this morning, Bianca? Then take them up to the table in Hilda's room. When she discovers them, she will be pleased. She is fond of strawberries." Bianca nodded acquiescence to all Hebe had said. Then she reached for the pan of peas, but Hebe stretched her arms over it, protecting it. "No, no, truly, I shall finish them. See all I have done already. Let me, Bianca. Crystal will help, won't you, Crystal?" Of course, Crystal was only too delighted to help, but the dark, brooding glance the Italian woman turned on her made her uneasy, and the involved Italian sentences she poured forth positively frightened her. Crystal saw that Bianca did not like her or approve of her, but what was even more disturbing, it looked as though she did not approve of Hebe, her guest either. Crystal breathed a sigh of relief then, when Bianca finally retreated into the kitchen, taking the berries with her. "She scolds," Hebe said lightly, "but don't be bothered by it, or her cross face either. She has a heart of gold. It is only that she doesn't trust me to finish the peas. I don't blame her. She would rather do them at her own time, as she said, in that burst of Italian just now, than have to do them later when I have forgotten them. Let's not forget them, but really put our minds on them and get them done. That will please her. Crystal understood. Of course Hebe was like herself, exactly like herself. She meant well, but often, very often, that was as far as she got. She would begin to think of something else, rather than the task on hand, and then it was never done. Bianca felt about that exactly the way Selina felt, only Selina was a sister, and Bianca was only Hebe's friend. Crystal wondered if a friend could forgive as easily as a sister. Anyway, Crystal understood the situation now, and she determined with Hebe to put her mind on the peas. They would think of nothing else until they were done. She is very tall for an Italian, isn't she? She remarked of Bianca. Yes, strangely. That is what makes her so frightening, don't you think? But she is your friend. You are visiting her. Oh, yes, she is my great friend. I never forget that. And she never really frightens me. But what is the name of that hill off there, above the wood? I have been wanting to walk down through the meadow, right through the long grass, in spite of the hay, through the wood, and up the hill. There is an inland view from there, isn't there? Crystal lifted her eyes from their determined attention to the peas dancing through her fingers into the pan. She brushed a thick wavy strand of dark hair from her brow. Long Hill, she said, eagerly. That's its name. But it is a long hill, I suppose. You go on and keep thinking you are coming out on the top, and it never comes. But at last it comes, and you see beyond, across a valley about a mile wide, to a whole range of mountains. It is the stillest place, that valley. No houses, no lakes, just the valley and the mountains. It is my favorite spot in all the world. It is a long walk, but it is better than the ocean, or the cliffs, or than anything. Hebe's eyes were on the hill while Crystal explained about it. Now she turned her face to Crystal. Let's go, she said, rising. I knew it would be like that. But the peas. Crystal did not get up. Well, yes, perhaps we'd better finish them. Of course we'd better. Only let's hurry. Their fingers flew now. No one will mind our walking through the long grass either, Crystal said. It belongs to this house. The owner never has it cut, and I don't suppose Victoria Gildersleeve will want to bother with hay, do you? Hebe shook her head. No, I hardly think she will, she said. We can go wading through it then. I was imagining doing that when you came. Do you know her, Victoria Gildersleeve? Crystal asked gently. Dance, dance, pop, pop. The peas went into the pan. It was getting fuller and fuller. Soon they would be finished. Hebe seemed absorbed in the green dance, but she answered after a minute, Yes, I know her. Crystal forgot her good resolutions about the task in hand, and stopped work. She bent forward. Really? Oh. How she wanted Hebe to go on, and say more, tell her about Victoria. But Hebe did not go on. That seemed all she meant to say. Yes, I know her. And so the peas were finished by Hebe, while Crystal, with eagerly clasped hands, waited for what never came. Hebe called into the kitchen, turning her head a little. "Here are your peas, Bianca." Bianca peered at once. She was pleased in her dark way, and showed it by a short nod as she took the pan Hebe lifted toward her. "You see, we have kept our promise." Hebe was looking up at her. "Now Crystal and I are going for a walk up Long Hill. Will you get me my hat?" Crystal was surprised, but she tried not to show it. It seemed odd, ordering a friend around like this, a friend whom you were visiting too, but really it hadn't been ordering around, not exactly. The way in which Hebe said, "Will you get me my hat?" made it seem something very pleasant to do, rather as though Hebe had said instead, "Will you be so kind as to accept these flowers?" Bianca went off with the peas, but she was several minutes in returning with the hat. "Not unpacked," she said, laconically in English, as an explanation of the delay. "Oh, of course I forgot," Hebe replied, taking it. Bianca grunted and retired. The hat was a wide, silver-gray straw. When Hebe had put it on her head, it cast a pearly shadow over her face. She was pale anyway, Hebe, but the hat accentuated her paleness, making it almost otherworldly. Crystal's thought leapt to Keats' La Belle Dame Sans Merci. "I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild." Now Hebe's hair was all hidden under the wide brim of her hat, and whether it was long or not, Crystal could not know, never having seen it down, and her eyes were certainly not wild. Her foot was light, and that was all that fitted the words of Keats' description of his Belle Dame Sans Merci. But the music of the words was here in Hebe, and if Crystal had met La Belle Dame Sans Merci in a woodland walk, she would have expected in her this same ivory pallor, the same glamour that lay over Hebe. "What are you thinking?" Hebe asked, seeing the expression on Crystal's all too expressive face. Crystal smiled. "I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me, as she did love, and made sweet moan. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy song." Hebe stood on the ground, and Crystal on the step. That way their eyes were level. Hebe listened to Crystal's recitation as unsurprisedly as though it were the song of a bird. That was what let Crystal go on with it. She had only intended a line to answer Hebe's question. "What made you think of that?" Hebe asked. "The shadow your hat makes on your face," Crystal answered. She did not laugh at herself saying it, or immediately cover it up with something else more sensible, as she would certainly have done had any one but Hebe caught her so suddenly in her thoughts. No need for self-disguise with Hebe. They crossed the lawn and waded into the golden sea of the meadow. It did not bother Crystal that Hebe said not a word all through the meadow and the woods, and indeed until they were well on the upward slope of Long Hill. Crystal herself did not want to talk. It was enough to be walking side by side, and Crystal quite forgot that there was such a thing as talk. Better to let the meadow talk, and the brook, and the long grass, and Hebe's walk. That was better than conversation. It was more like music than anything else. Music accompanying Crystal's steps, making them lighter. But when they had climbed the hill a little way, they stopped to look back. Crystal spoke, but her voice did not break or mar what the silence had given them. She said, "It's like reading some book, don't you think? At the first page you are pleased, but every page you turn opens your pleasure wider and wider. The view gets nicer and nicer, and soon we'll see the ocean, and Madame Coldwater's estate with its blue diamond lake. All the same, it's the other side I like best, as I told you. Just the valley and the hills." From then on, they chatted a little. Crystal returned to Victoria Gildersleeve, but there Hebe disappointed her. Could it be that Hebe didn't appreciate Victoria? Crystal found it hard to believe that, yet it did seem so. She was so cool about Victoria, and she did not like the subject. Crystal realized at once that she did not like the subject at all. This was a flaw in Hebe, but Crystal ignored it, or rather she put it carefully away in her mind to think about later, when she would be freer to find excuses for it. But when they came in sight of the final stretch of hill that meant the end of their climb, Crystal suddenly stopped short and uttered a sound of protest. Right on the very top of the hill, at the edge of the shade of white birches growing there, stood a little tent house, a construction of canvas, perfectly square. Its back was to them. At least no door or window was visible. "Now what is that?" Crystal exclaimed, utterly surprised. Hebe shaded her eyes. "It's a house," she answered. "I don't see anyone. Do you? Is it new, Crystal? Didn't you know it was here?" Yes, it was decidedly new. Only last week Crystal had been up here, once with Agnes, and once alone. There was no house there then. Crystal felt that that particular spot, the place of the white birches, was hers, perhaps more hers than her own room at Tingle Bell. "It may be a camper," Hebe hazarded. "The thing's made of canvas." "It can't be campers," Crystal explained, "because it's on Madame Coldwater's land. She wouldn't let anyone camp there. She doesn't use it herself, of course, but it is owned by her, and she would know." "Well, let's go on up and see," Hebe suggested. "It can't spoil the view." "But the birches," Crystal complained. "It is so nice under them. It's like a little room, with a flowery carpet and green doors opening into the valley. I thought we'd sit there just all alone." "Perhaps we still can," Hebe tried to comfort. She saw that Crystal was really upset about it. Perhaps no one's there at all, though it would be a jolly place for a camp. Or perhaps they're away. Let's go on. As they went, Crystal returned to the Victoria Gildersleeve theme. She could not leave it alone. Some way in spite of Hebe's indifference. "You see," she said, "why I want so much to know things about Victoria Gildersleeve is because I'm going to be an actress myself, so it's more than curiosity." She thought this would justify her, perhaps, and make Hebe understand and unbend, but it had just the opposite effect. Hebe paused for an instant and looked at Crystal. Her expression was enigmatical, but her words were clear enough. "Oh no, please, my dear." But Crystal, in spite of Hebe's protest, nodded. "Yes," she said, "I am." Chapter 6. On the View. They were talking as they came up to the view, and had almost forgotten about the tent house there, and that it might be occupied. As they came around by the side of it, they were startled by a sound, a human sound, a man clearing his throat. He was sitting with his back against a post of the house, balancing a sketching pad on his knee. But almost as soon as they had discovered him, he was on his feet. He was a young man in white flannel, who did not at all look the artist he was. At least, there were no paint smudges, no studied untidiness of dress, and his hair was of conventional length. But he was a young man, at whom the most casual would look twice. He was very brown, from much acquaintance with the sun, and his eyes were a smoky blue, intent and striking eyes. Hebe said, "Pardon us, we didn't realize there was anyone here." They had almost stepped on a drawing board, and they had come so close to the young man's house and work that it was truly as though they had broken into his studio. "Not at all," he replied most politely. "You came for the view. Don't mind me." Hebe did not answer. Her words of apology had been spoken tonelessly, and her glance had passed over the young man as impersonally as though he were only a section of the view. The colorless tone surprised Crystal by its very strangeness, coming from Hebe, and she looked at her questioningly. The young man looked at her, too, with interest. "I am Alexander Coldwater," he introduced himself, apparently not meaning to be ignored. "I am visiting my grandmother down there." He indicated a very large house below them, between the sea and the hill, a house with a lake lying against it. You could not say that the house stood against the lake, for the house was larger. A lake that was strangely blue. Blue Diamond, her summer place, he finished. The estate was named from the lake, of course. It was like a blue diamond, that lake. Hebe glanced back over her shoulder and down at it. "But don't mind me," the young man repeated, his first remark after the briefest pause, when no one said anything. "This is quite the best spot to get the view. I won't speak." Hebe nodded, and turning her back on the sea view, faced the valley view. It was a golden valley, made up of meadows and fields, a mildly cultivated valley, although there was not the sign of a dwelling or a human being in it. And rising up out of it, not more than a mile away, was a half-circle of mountain range, wrapped in a blue summer haze. Crystal stood looking at Hebe, waiting for her word about it. Alexander was looking at Hebe, too, but with no interest in her thoughts about the landscape. He was seeing the way she stood, the way she held her head. His was an artist's eye. But where had he seen someone standing like that before? And just that poise of the head. She moved a step or two, took off her hat, and swinging it in one hand, shaded her eyes with the other. When had he seen someone move like that? The lift of her arm, the hand. Young children moved like that, rather, and lifted their arms so. Alexander remembered a little cousin of 8, shading her eyes at the Parthenon last winter. Other children came to mind, graceful, unself-conscious children, but where had there ever been an adult with that grace? Wait, there was an echo of it in Victoria Gildersleeve. He had seen her many times, on the stage, and on the screen. He forgot his promise not to speak, and eagerly, and with some awe burst out, "Oh, I say, are you Victoria Gildersleeve?" His grandmother had told him that she was coming to spend the summer in Fairfleet. He had no doubts that here she was on his view. This was luck. He brought her gaze from the circle of hills, slowly, as though she had only half heard the young man's question. In fact, Crystal thought she had not heard it at all, and answered for her, "No." But Alexander did not take his eager eyes from Hebe's face. She thought he had not heard Crystal. So she said distinctly, but in the colorless voice that surprised Crystal in her, "I am the friend of her housekeeper." "Yes. Well," he seemed very much nonplussed, so nonplussed that he went on forgetting his promise to be quiet and let them enjoy the view. "Do you like it, that hazy valley, better than the sea at your back and Blue Diamond?" "Yes, I am like Crystal. This satisfies me," Hebe replied. Now Alexander looked at Crystal. She was in her yellow dress, the dress that in texture and color made her think of ancient Egypt. It was a very slimming frock, with a wide belt of the same yellow linen around the hips, and an open V at the neck. Crystal, with a thick, waving strand of her hair blown against her cheek, her dark eyes holding stillness, safe in clear depth, belonged to her own conception of the dress. She might have stepped out of an ancient Egyptian frieze, be one of those stiff figures come to life and a summer day. But the only reminiscence of conventional stiffness left was the restrained, delicate dignity of her youth. His having blundered so with Hebe had parted Alexander from his poise. He said now, "And you, I have never seen you before. You weren't at Madame's, my grandmother's party?" Crystal shook her head. No, she and Selina had not been invited to the party, but she did not tell him that. He went on, thrown off his guard entirely by the silent, absent Hebe. "Oh, say, I'd like to paint you two up here in this light. A regular portrait. I think I could too." "Do you? Are you an artist? May we see something you have done?" Hebe's interest sounded genuine enough, though cool. "Oh yes, if you will." He plunged into the tent house and returned almost instantly with several canvases. "Let's take them back into the shade," Hebe suggested, "and sit down." The three moved back into the shadow the clump of white birches made. This was where Crystal had meant to rest with Hebe, alone in blowing shade, but she had entirely forgotten that disappointment in her interest in all that was happening instead. Hebe sat down in the short grass, placing her wide, silvery hat beside her. Crystal knelt at her other side, leaning at her shoulder. Nothing was left for Alexander but to place the drawing and paintings in Hebe's lap and find a place in front of the two as audience. He did it, awkward with excitement and suspense. He studied Hebe as she picked up the sketches, one by one, examining them without comment. If she had been a famous art critic, his attention to her could not have been more intent. Crystal, leaning at Hebe's shoulder, did not find the pictures particularly impressive. They were too strange and not beautiful. She had heard enough art gossip to know that they must be impressionistic or futurist or something like that, most of them. She did not see why Hebe held each one so long a time and studied it so intently. She was a little relieved when the last one was reached, and Hebe put them all down. "They are surprising," Hebe commented, and she had forgotten to use her toneless voice. All its quality was back. "Are they?" Alexander asked, eagerly, bending forward. "I hoped you would think so, but I wondered whether you'd say so. How long have you been painting?" "No, I don't care how long. It doesn't matter." "You know," Alexander said, talking very fast, "I rather expected you might think them surprising. Be surprised that I could do 'em, I mean. But I was terribly afraid you'd scorn 'em. I thought you didn't like this sort of thing." Hebe raised her eyes to him. "How could you think that?" she asked. "I am a stranger. You can't know what I like." Alexander dropped his eyes to her hands, her long, tapering hands, lying on the pile of his pictures. "No, of course, I couldn't know," he acquiesced, but there was no conviction in his voice. "As a matter of fact," Hebe went on, moving her hands from the pictures and touching a petal of pearly everlasting, but not picking the flower, "I don't like them at all. I frankly dislike them, but you have known what you were doing. That is the point. If you should paint us, Crystal and me, as you suggested, would you do it straightforwardly, not like these?" Alexander sat up. He looked as though he couldn't believe his senses, but a light had broken over his face. "You mean I may, but you never let anyone else?" "You can't know that," Hebe said firmly. "You can't know anything about me." She looked at Crystal. "Shall we let him paint us?" she asked. "Oh yes, if you want," Crystal agreed. Somehow it didn't seem real, any of this. It was so different from anything else that had ever happened on her view. But Hebe was real. If she wanted to be painted, Crystal was happy to do whatever she said. "Then it must be a bargain," Hebe told Alexander, seriously. a real bargain. Will you bargain with me? Of course. Anything. The honor. It is nonsense about the honor. Listen. You are to call me Miss Hebe. I had meant to call you Miss Housekeeper's friend. Won't that do as well? I don't believe you understand. Hebe spoke with particular quietness. It is a bargain in earnest. Alexander was silent, taking it in. Then he said, I do understand now. My mind has become acrobatic, and performed unknown feats, as I hesitated. Until this instant, I have been unutterably stupid in all this. Forgive that, and I strike the bargain, I swear. But then, with a return of amusement, he looked at Crystal. And you, what must I call you? He asked. Hebe answered for her. I will introduce you. She said, Crystal, this is Alexander Coldwater, and Mr. Coldwater, this is Crystal Barker. She lives in that adorable house on the village street, the little, very old house with the white door-stone. They call it Tinklebell. She and I have happened to become friends without introductions. We like the same views, the same poetry, and that sort of thing. Oh, I see. The amused light had vanished from Alexander's eyes entirely, and then, as though to cover up some sudden confusion in his mind, a second time he asked Crystal, You weren't at our party yesterday. I am sure you weren't. His abruptness jolted Crystal into blurting, No, we weren't invited. Oh, but I thought everyone was invited. He turned to Hebe. It's sort of the lady of the manor idea, you know. My grandmother, once in a season, invites all the countryside friends too, and all the summer people who have called on her and whom she never has time to call on. She does it all up at once, but she hasn't been here for 3 years now. There would be new people she wouldn't know about, though her secretary is supposed to be pretty careful and get them all into the fold. Grandmother's amusing, rather, about the necessity and the importance of that party. It's the only social debt she pays in Fairfleet. One thorough clean sweep, for conscience sake. He returned to Crystal. You were lucky, though. Blue diamonds, so big, you wouldn't think there could be a crush there, but there was yesterday. If Miss Grant and Madame's secretary hadn't helped out with the hostessing, I don't know where we would have been at. But he was intent on getting to work now. He brought an easel from his tent and a stool. He wanted to paint Hebe and Crystal exactly as they were, in that very spot, without moving. Only Hebe must put the wide, silvery straw hat on her knees. He worked with complete concentration, his eyes quick and keen for all their smoky quality, bent forward eagerly over his big palette. Hebe he let look away at the view, as she wished, but he made Crystal look directly at him. He met her eyes after a while and said, suddenly, I am sorry, but I have forgotten your name. He spoke as though Hebe were away or asleep. Anyway, as though he and Crystal were alone, and he had just discovered it. Crystal, he nodded. Of course, that's it. but can I paint it?" The name seemed to satisfy him about something and to help him with what he was doing. He worked more surely, with narrowed eyes. While he painted, he did not say a word. She had removed quite a way into her own musings, but Crystal and Alexander got acquainted. He was as easy to talk to as Dr. Grant, easier, because he was more nearly her own age, and he made you laugh, too, sudden, chuckling laughter. Dr. Grant never did that, but why compare them at all? Alexander was a young man, full of life and eagerness and fun. Dr. Grant was old and tired, but she did compare them, for Dr. Grant had given her great friendliness for all the years she had known him, and Alexander here, in this first hour of their meeting, was holding out toward her the same gift of friendliness. When Hebe at last did speak, it was to ask about the time. "Is it late, I wonder?" Alexander squinted at the sun. "About 2, I should think." Crystal jumped. "Selina, she won't know what's become of me. I'm sorry." Hebe took the responsibility. "I should have thought about that. Bianca won't mind. She is wise enough never to expect me. But Selina is different. I should have remembered." Hebe would not promise Alexander when they would come again, but she did say it would be soon. "But you see, I'm not always up here at the tent." He reminded her. "How shall I know? When are you likely to be here?" "Oh, mornings. Often all day, really. I built it to escape from Blue Diamond and get a lot of work done. All my things are here. Sometimes I stay all day. Last night I slept here." "We'll take a chance then. We'll just come up." "Soon." "Yes, soon." He did not let them see the picture. "Not until it's nearer done, please." He was firm about that. "But you promise that it's not impressionistic?" "Yes, of course." He looked at Crystal as he answered Hebe. "It couldn't be. It's got to be clear," he affirmed. Hebe nodded. She understood, and the understanding had something to do with Crystal, but Crystal herself had not understood. It was almost 3 in the afternoon when she got back to Tingle Bell. Selina had given up waiting for her and had had her own luncheon. She imagined that Crystal had been invited to stay at Seaview with the Gildersleeves. She knew there was no telephone up there. That was another of the queer things about Victoria Gildersleeve that Miss Grant had mentioned when she dropped in this morning. She hadn't wanted a telephone, even when she meant to spend the summer at Seaview herself. So not being able to telephone Selina, Crystal had probably trusted her to guess the reason for her non-appearance at 1 o'clock, their luncheon hour. But Selina was watching for her now a little anxiously. She really ought not to stay up there all day, not this very first time. "I'm in my room," Selina called out when she heard the screen door bang. Crystal ran up to her. Selina was sorting out her top bureau drawer, collars, handkerchiefs, sashes, ribbons, and delicate little sachet bags. She was ranging them in orderly piles on the white counterpane of her bed preparatory to replacing them in the bureau. "Pull the shades, dear, will you?" she said, not lifting her eyes from her occupation. "The sun is getting around to this side of the house." Crystal pulled the green window shades on the sun's side of the room, and then she waited, not saying anything. She had expected to find Selina anxious and perhaps holding back luncheon. In preparation for this, she was overflowing with contrition and explanations. "Well," Selina asked, now looking up because she had finished her sorting and was really interested in Crystal's day. "Do tell me all about it. Did she like the strawberries? Do you like her? Tell me everything." Crystal came and sat on the other side of the bed, disarraying the piles a little, and not noticing. "The strawberries?" she asked vaguely. "Yes. Hilda, was she pleased?" "I hope so. They're in a silver dish in her bedroom." Crystal said no more. She didn't know just how to begin her account of the wonderfulness of the day, but when somehow Selina had managed to get her started, and learned that she had not been spending the time with Hilda, but all those hours had been off with Hebe, the housekeeper's friend, instead, she was a little dismayed, but her mind did not linger there. "That means you haven't had lunch," she exclaimed. Crystal admitted it. Selina wasted no more time just then on the story, but hurried her down to the kitchen. "You're as pale as you can be," she insisted. "And oh, Crystal, you do bother me. There's some asparagus, salad, and graham muffins. I'm going to make you cocoa." "It's too hot for cocoa. Please don't. I am hungry, though." "Of course you're hungry." Crystal was sitting at her place in the shaded dining room, her salad and 2 graham muffins eaten, just beginning on a cold grapefruit for dessert, when she got as far as Alexander in the story. Selina was frowning, her lovely lips drawn in a straight line. A frown and drawn lips with Selina were so unusual that Crystal stopped amazed. "What's the matter?" she begged. "Oh, Selina, I have done something wrong." Selina shook her head. "No, not wrong. You couldn't, of course. But oh, I do wish it hadn't happened. It just did happen, I know. It's no one's fault. Only, Crystal, you mustn't go back. Alexander Coldwater can't paint your picture. You mustn't go up to the View again this summer." "Why not? That's funny." "Yes, it must seem funny, but I'm right, and the bother of it is, I can't explain. I never thought I'd have to. You'll just have to take my word for it. But we promised to go back soon." "Crystal, you mustn't. I don't often boss you like this, do I? But it's something about Mother. Mother wouldn't want you to go. Wouldn't want Alexander Coldwater to paint your picture. Truly. Will you promise me?" Crystal looked at her sister, surprised and awed at the bringing in of their dead mother, but she couldn't hold out against that name. "Of course I'll promise," she said, "only it's dreadfully disappointing. And how can I ever explain to Hebe and Alexander?" "We'll find some way to explain," Selina assured her. "We'll have to think about it. Wouldn't you like some tea, Crystal?" Selina didn't at all approve of Cristel at 16 drinking tea. She offered it now simply to show that she was as sorry as Cristel and wanted her to know it, and Cristel more to help Selina in her kindliness than wanting the tea, let her make it for her. Characteristically, Cristel did not press Selina for reasons any more. Curiosity had never developed, even normally, in Cristel's nature. Her whole mind now was taken up with disappointment, not wonder. That night, Dr. Grant did dine with his family, and Agnes, in the course of the meal, said, "Oh, Father, we looked up Fireweed in a book Paul has, and it's called Fireweed only because it's the first thing to come back on ground that's been burnt over. It comes back almost before the grass." Dr. Grant put down his fork. "You looked it up," he asked, "in a book at the Gildersleeves. I hope you didn't repeat what we had been saying about Cristel." Agnes reddened. "Of course not. Of course I wouldn't." Dr. Grant saw the red in her cheeks, and he patted her hand, which lay near him, on the table apologetically. "I knew that about Fireweed, little girl," he said. "That's exactly why I thought of your friend in the connection. There she grows, on ground that's been burnt over, no family left, but in spite of the barren background, her flowers are sturdy." Miss Grant laughed, amused. "Then Selina must be Fireweed too," she asserted. "You've turned very poetical today, Charles." Dr. Grant thought about it, looking at his wife. "No," he said, finally and with assurance. "Selina's not Fireweed. I don't know how it is, for to all appearances she ought to be, but she grows on the edge of the charred ground, I think. A lily of ancient cultivation. Cristel's the Fireweed." Miss Grant shrugged, but amiably. "Give me the lily," she said, "but you've always been rather doting when it comes to Cristel. Let's talk something more worthwhile than gossip tonight, though. What do you think of the President's address? Did you read it?" Chapter 7. A Select Circle. There followed a very strange week for Cristel. It was strange because it was so mixed up, or rather, Cristel was so mixed up in her feelings. She was miserable, happy, lonely, contented, uneasy, tranquil, gay, and sorrowful all at once. She was restless because Hebe had vanished, and she did not know how to find her again. No one spoke of her. Evidently no one but Cristel ever thought about her at all. And when Cristel asked, as she did once or twice when people were talking with Selina about the occupants of Seaview, "What about Hebe? Do you ever see her anywhere?" the gossiping person would look vague for an instant, and then remembering, would reply, "Oh no, not a sign." Is she still there? Apparently no one had set eyes on her since that day of arrival, when she walked through the village street carrying Cristel's larkspurs. But Cristel knew she must still be at Seaview, because she had said she meant to stay all summer, and besides, she had promised Alexander to go back to the View and sit for the portrait. The obvious way to relieve her mind about Hebe, of course, and see her again, would be to march right up to the Red House itself and ask for her. But she was shy about doing that for 2 reasons. The first and strongest reason was Hebe herself. Crystal did not want to impose herself on her. She thought Hebe should choose the time for their next meeting. Crystal felt too humble and too grateful for the friendship between them to intrude on the wonderful person so soon again. The second reason for not going up to the Red House was Hilda. Crystal had not spoken to her since being sent around to the back door with the strawberries. She had seen her passing Tinkle Bell's windows sometimes, usually with Agnes, and once with Agnes and Esther together, and downtown Crystal had dashed up side streets once or twice to avoid meeting them. She did not feel now that Hilda owed her any apology. She rather owed her one for having run away and not given her a chance to explain. But she was filled with self-consciousness, even so, a self-consciousness that was deepened by Agnes's unbelievable behavior. For Agnes, her intimate and best friend, had entirely forsaken her. They had not spoken to each other since that night when Agnes had called up after Madame Coldwater's party, and she was never apart from Hilda. Since Crystal was avoiding Hilda so strenuously, she could not help avoiding Agnes too, but that almost a week should have melted away, and Agnes not come to Tinklebell, or even telephone, was very strange. It made Crystal feel lonely and wistful. Couldn't Agnes be friends with Hilda and her at the same time? Was she put out with her about something? Crystal had not the courage to call her up, as Selina often suggested she should, to find out. She wouldn't be at home, probably, she gave as her excuse to Selina. She would be up at the Red House. I saw Hilda at the post office this morning. Selina offered one noon while they were doing the dishes together. She looks very nice. Wouldn't you like to ask her to come here this afternoon? You could have lemonade and cookies. But Crystal shook her head. No, she said, indifferently. Don't you remember Miss Grant said she was motoring them to Barrington to see the round-the-world flyers? Oh, yes. Selina remembered now. But tomorrow, she thought Crystal and Hilda couldn't help getting on well together. They were almost exactly the same age, and Agnes seems to be having such a good time with her. But Crystal changed the subject. It made her uneasy to have Selina worrying like this about her. The whole situation filled her with embarrassment and a kind of shame before Selina. She simply couldn't talk it over with her. Selina was placing the glasses she had dried on the clock shelf out of the way for the time, not to get broken. How pretty Selina is, Crystal thought to herself, forgetting more unpleasant things. It was a common thought with her, but one that never lost its instant of surprise and fresh delight. Only pretty wasn't the word, of course. Selina was beautiful. Miss Grant was pretty, and Agnes. Selina was very much more than that. Her honey-colored, smoothly coiled hair, her serene gray eyes, her classical features, her long but well-rounded limbs, all made harmonious beauty, and she looked supremely healthy without being tiresomely energetic. It was womanly beauty, the sort of loveliness that outlives all fashions in feminine comeliness, and constitutes, through the ages, the soul's ideal of woman. What of Hebe in these comparisons? No, decidedly, Hebe was not beautiful, not with Selina to measure by. And she was not pretty either, not remembering Miss Grant's and Agnes's prettiness. She was too pale, too inconspicuous, except for her gracefulness, to be thought about much at all in that way. Her features were small and well finished, but not noticeable. Her eyes, unless you were looking into them directly, were not extraordinary, and when you were looking into them directly, it was only the feeling they gave you that was remarkable. Nothing about the eyes as eyes. And she was pale. Decidedly she was pale. Selina's skin had a rich glow, a golden glow like autumn fruit, and Miss Grant was pink and white, but Hebe had no color, or if she had color, it was that of a pearl. You would have to bend close and look deep into its heart. Crystal had never seen a real pearl, but she had imagination about them. I set her on my prancing steed, and nothing else saw all day long. For a side long would she bend and sing a fairy song. Selina had her glasses safe, and now found no more dishes in the drainer to occupy her. Crystal was plainly dreaming. If Selina could know how, complimentary to herself, some of her sister's dreaming in the last seconds had been, perhaps she would not now have spoken so impatiently. But it was a very warm afternoon, and Selina, for all her tranquillity of spirit, was finding the dishes a bore. She wanted to put on her coolest lawn frock and go down to the end of the garden with a book. Why couldn't Crystal attend more to what she was doing? "I do wish," she exclaimed, "that you'd remember to wear an apron when you wash dishes. You've spattered water all over that linen, and it spots. I should think you'd hate to work in a dress you mean to wear all afternoon anyway. Please go on with the silver. I believe if you can't be tidier about your hair, spend more time on it. It'll have to be cut, bobbed like Esther's." Crystal put a quick, soap-sudsy hand to her hair. "Oh no, it mustn't be cut, Selina." It had been cut that time when she was so sick with diphtheria, but it had grown out again. It had grown below her shoulders, halfway down her back, soft, brown, fine hair, with a loose wave in it, not quite a curl. It was a dense brown, with no lights, shadowy. She meant to do it as Selina did hers, but usually, as today, it ended with the intention. A short wavy lock, part of the bang of 2 years ago, hung against her cheek, and the knot at the back wasn't a knot at all, just a loose bunch of slipping wave. She brushed away the lock, leaving it frosted with suds, and repeated, "It mustn't be cut." "I know you want to keep it long," Selina said, still irritatedly, "but I can't see why. It's fashionable as well as becoming short, and so much less bother. Do get on with the dishes, though. Selina, you do know. Don't pretend you forget. I've got to keep my hair long for parts. You couldn't play Juliet with bobbed hair, or Lady Macbeth. It's much better not to have to wear a wig." More dishes were going into the drainer by now, and Selina was drying them with the dispatch of an adept. The slight frown between her eyes was caused by Crystal's needless splashing as she tumbled the forks and knives, and the way she was leaving the soap to fade away in the water. Not at all by Crystal's words. Long since she had become reconciled to Crystal's ambitions, but she never would become reconciled to soap being wasted like that. She answered abstractedly, rescuing the floating sphere. "I imagine there'd be time enough for your hair to grow before you act Juliet. But you're 16 now, and I'm not going to argue with you about it. It's your hair." After a while, she spoke again, more gently. Selina was always remorseful the minute after using a sharp tone with Crystal. It's a shame Victoria Gildersleeve didn't come herself, though. She could have advised you how to go about becoming an actress. It's awfully disappointing, and I think you've been great about that, Crystal, not to care more. Of course, Crystal had cared, and that caring had been growing all this lonely week. It had so nearly happened. Her one comfort had been, and a strange comfort it was, that perhaps if Victoria were in Fairfleet, she herself would see nothing of her. Rumors of her exclusiveness were growing. It was said that her circle of acquaintances was very small indeed, and that she kept it small with definite intention. Only a handful of people could be said to know her at all intimately, and they were rather breathtakingly exalted people, including a queen and an Eastern poet-philosopher. In cities, she was never pointed out on streets or in galleries as Victoria, the great actress. She moved too carefully for that, with almost a bodyguard to protect her aloofness. No one knew where she spent her vacations, or in fact, how she spent her playtime at all. Society of two continents would gladly have worn her like a jewel, but she would not be worn, and interviewers never got to her. The general conception had grown up that she gave most of herself to her art, and the little that remained was kept for those close and so carefully chosen intimates, including a queen. So really, what chance was there that Crystal would ever have heard her voice? Probably she wouldn't even have taken the larkspurs or given her a glance at the station. And now, with all this new information about Victoria Gildersleeve in her mind, could Crystal less than ever imagine how it would have been if she had come on that train? Wouldn't she have been carried from it in a palanquin with silvery curtains drawn? It wouldn't have surprised Crystal a bit. But as a climax to all this cogitation, Crystal burst forth, "I don't care. If I could have spoken to her just once and told her that I myself am going to be an actress, I think she would have been interested, and helped me. She couldn't help seeing that it's real with me." Selina started. She had forgotten her own sympathetic words that had called this forth, for at the time Crystal had not responded. Now she remembered. She laughed but uneasily. "I can't understand how you ever got this way, Crystal," she said. "Whenever you speak like that, I actually get cold shivers in my spine. How can you be so sure it's real with you? Even if you had a chance, how do you know you could act? You've never done any acting. And even if you have talent, it's the hardest thing in the world to get an opportunity to prove it. Everyone says so. It takes pull, and just lots of things you haven't. And you have to be sort of hard, Crystal, and strong, too. You are so gentle. And then there's Father. He wanted to be an actor. It almost ruined Mother's life. In fact, they'd both probably be alive today if he hadn't gone west with that road company and got typhoid. Mother really died of grief. The doctors didn't say so, I know, but Grandmother always said so, and Grandmother knew more than a dozen doctors. She said Father would have got well from the typhoid too, if he had only been successful in his acting. It was grief with him too, in a way. He never got any notice at all, in spite of all his ambition." Crystal took her hands from the dishwasher and sat down on the kitchen stool, which was conveniently near at hand. Now her linen frock, unprotected by an apron, was ruined. Soap suds, as well as water soaking into her lap. But Selina had not the heart to scold. Her sister's expression was too tragic. "Oh, you never said that before," Crystal exclaimed in a low, intense voice. "Not that about his not getting success, but I guessed it. I never dared say it to you, though. It was too sad. I've lain awake in the night thinking about it. I knew he broke his heart. No one ever saw he had genius. He was just passed over. But all the more, Selina, and just for that, he wants me to try. He wants me to be a great and famous actress, just as great as Victoria, if I can. He understands." Then to Selina's bewildered look, she rushed on. "Yes, he's dead. But what's church about if it doesn't mean he's alive too, more alive than ever? And if he's alive, he cares, and I can please him. Perhaps it's Father that makes me so sure, because he's so sure for me." Selina's voice brought back her own, as well as Crystal's composure, when she answered this outburst. "He was just as sure about himself as you are, Crystal. It is wise, don't you think, to remember that he didn't get recognition in spite of his success." Crystal was quieter now, but she did not waver. "No, he wasn't as sure," she said. "If he had been, then it would have worked. That's the difference. He wanted it awfully, but I want it, and also I know I'm going to get it." Crystal dried her hands on the towel hanging by the sink. Alas, she had forgotten that the dishes were not finished. She did not give the sink a glance as she left the kitchen and went up to her room. She wanted to be near her father's picture there. Selina, left behind, looked at the unfinished work absently. She plunged her own hands into the water, opal with suds, and found the dishcloth. Soon she began to hum. After all, it was rather pleasant to be alone in the shady, tidy little old kitchen, the smell of freshly baked cookies cooling on the kitchen table, mingling with the smell of honeysuckle from the arbor, and she wished she could help Crystal toward her career. She didn't agree with Miss Grant that the whole idea was foolish. It couldn't be foolish if Crystal cared so much, but she wanted her to go through college first. If they only could manage college for Crystal, perhaps the way toward a stage career might open up there. They were paying more attention to dramatics in colleges all the time, she knew. Of course, that was the answer. Only Crystal was so disconcertingly impatient. She didn't want to wait for college. She wanted to go on the stage, straight from high school. Still, Selina hummed on. The mingled smell of cookies and honeysuckle was very, very nice. And soon, now that Crystal was not here muddling progress, the work would be finished, and Selina could get down into the garden with a book. But bless Crystal, Selina's thoughts would always hold a blessing for her dear funny Crystal. The house the Barker girls had inherited from their mother was as attractive inside as out. All the furniture had come from their professor grandfather's dwelling in Cambridge. It suited the low-ceilinged, well-proportioned rooms, most of it being quite as old as the house, built in a period when workmanship was an art and a joy to the worker, and Selina's touch had lent grace to all the arrangements of it. The staircase was very steep, almost a ladder for steepness, and short. Crystal's room was just at the top. This bedroom was all her own. She had arranged it and planned it, so it was different from the rest of the house, which was really Selina's. On a low, unpolished oblong table at the head of her cot bed stood a framed photograph of her father, together with a book or two, a candle, and her journal. Crystal picked up the photograph now, but put it down directly. There was nothing satisfying in it. He must be more alive than that, her father. It was merely the picture of a good-looking young man, trying not to look self-conscious. His eyes were like Crystal's, and the poise of his head. The picture was taken in such a way that the eyes seemed to follow you when you moved. They followed Crystal, now to where she went to sit on a cushion on the floor beside the low dormer window. You had to sit on the floor if you were to get the good of the window. A cool breeze was rustling in the maple boughs outside, in spite of the heat of early afternoon. The brown lock at Crystal's cheek trembled as the maple leaves trembled, so the breeze had found its way in at the casement. Just above the window hung her bookshelf, the soul of the room. She looked up and along the titles now, but with no intention of taking one down to read. The books stood square, returning her friendliness. There was Howard Pyle's Robin Hood, and his King Arthur too. Next came Scottish Chiefs, and the Oxford Book of English Verse. They were clumped together because they were big books, thick and tall, beside them, and next in size, stood Lorna Doone, to have and to hold, Joan of Arc, Tom Sawyer, Ivanhoe, and David Copperfield. Those were the novels. Then came the poetry, little books, much worn. The poetry books had a right to their shabby covers, for sometimes they had lain out in queer places, forgotten by their owner. The Keats, in fact, had spent all of one night on the View just last spring. Crystal had gone up Long Hill in search of it a little after dawn, much in fear of not finding it this time, for it was very precious, but it had stayed where it had been dropped, and awaited her in a bank of pearly everlasting, its green leather cover not so very much the worse for the wet leaves and a dropped wet petal or two. Besides Keats, there were Rupert Brooke and James Stephens, and then Tennyson, a very thumb-worn Tennyson, and at the end, to brace the lot so that they would not fall, a big thick book lay on its side, the best loved of all from earliest days, George MacDonald's, At the Back of the North Wind. Crystal was fortunate in books, and there were many more downstairs in the parlor, ranged in long cases on either side the Franklin stove. Those had been her mother's and her grandfather's, but these up here were Crystal's very own, most of them books she had bought herself, or that Selina had given her. These were the intimates she had chosen, just as that Queen and other great ones of the world were the intimates whom Victoria Gildersleeve had chosen, she reflected. Then she thought of Hebe, the housekeeper's friend. Why, she was dear enough, precious enough, to come and take her place with these chosen ones. She really belonged in this select little circle. Crystal smiled at this thought, though she had not smiled at the earlier one, of her books corresponding to Victoria Gildersleeve's intimates. But though she smiled, she was serious. Her books would welcome Hebe. In imagination she put her there, a miniature Hebe, whose head as she sat came level with the top of the Rupert Brooke book of poems. She would have to sacrifice, to have and to hold, to make room for Hebe on the shelf, but that was all right. To have and to hold belonged with the novels downstairs. Crystal could not quite understand how it had ever won its place up here anyway. The imaginary, book-sized Hebe sat now quite comfortably blotting out to have and to hold, her head tipped back a little against the wall behind, the wide, undecorated, silvery straw hat on her knees, her heelless, sandaled feet just on a level with Crystal's eyes. She was smiling in her way of smiling, the corners of her mouth lifted just a little, a restrained and delicate smile. She was complete, even to her tapering hands, circling the crown of the silvery hat, and the pearly ribbons at her wrist. O. Keats and Tennyson and the rest did not pale beside her, nor she beside them. She fitted in like a jewel in a box of jewels, a lovely, lustrous pearl. It's just as well I'm not seeing Agnes so much now, Crystal suddenly thought, as she sat cross-legged on her cushion, gazing up at her imaginary Hebe. I couldn't help talking about Hebe, and Agnes would say I had a crush. I don't understand about crushes, though. I think Miss Putnam's school is all wrong about them. That is, if this is what a crush is like. She remembered church last Sunday and a deep voice reading. Whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, if there be any virtue, any praise, think on these things. Well, no need to bother about Miss Putnam's standards then, with St. Paul to prop her up. Part 2. Across the Narrow Bridge. Chapter 8. Hebe at Tinklebell. The very next morning, almost in spite of herself, Crystal gave in and went up to the Red House to see Hebe. She went by way of the fields, not a short cut, but with this advantage: it brought her directly to the back door without coming into the vision of the front of the house. This morning Hebe was not sitting on the back steps, and the kitchen door was closed. It took more courage than Crystal had imagined she possessed to knock. Bianca answered. She stood behind the screen, looking down at Crystal, but either the screen lent an illusion, or Crystal was right in her impression that Bianca did not look disapproving, that there was even something friendly in her somber face. "Is Hebe at home?" Crystal asked. "I thought she might want to walk or something. It's such a nice day." Bianca hesitated, only the fraction of a second, before she opened the screen. "Come in," she invited, in her very broken English. "I'll see." She left Crystal standing, and after she had drawn some pans of bread from the oven and put them away in the pantry, she went off through a door in search of her friend. Crystal surveyed the kitchen. It was very big, and as neat as wax. It was like wax, too, in color, waxy yellow floors and walls, and it was very cool. There were windows on two sides. The windows on the door side were closed, and the dark window shades pulled. That was the sun's side, and Bianca was wise in keeping it closed this very warm July morning. An odd thing about the kitchen was its number of doors. Crystal counted them. There were exactly 8. Where did they all go? From the other side of one she heard a laugh, closely followed by voices. The laugh was Agnes's. It was a nice laugh, Agnes's, whole-hearted and pleasant. Then came the trum of a piano. Was Agnes playing? Yes, for Esther began to sing, "A Home by the Deep Rolling Sea." Another voice, as well as Agnes's, joined in the chorus, but halfway through the second verse the song broke off in the middle, and there was laughter and more talk, then steps. Crystal hoped heartily they wouldn't come through that door into the kitchen. It wasn't that she would be ashamed to be discovered here waiting for Hebe. She wouldn't be a bit, but Agnes would make her explain, and then, when she laughed at the explanation, Crystal would be angry. Crystal avoided being angry, as a burnt child avoids a fire. Long ago she had learned the lesson of how it hurts. And besides, of course, she would be embarrassed to come face to face with Hilda, especially surprised, like this, in Hilda's own kitchen. But the door did not open. The voices grew faint and died away altogether. Now Crystal, began to look for Bianca's return with Hebe. She did hope Hebe would agree to going for a walk, but in any case, Crystal had decided on what her excuse for the call would be. She must explain to Hebe about Selina's having forbidden her to go up to the view as long as Alexander Coldwater had his canvas studio there. A slight noise at her back made her turn nervously. She had been looking directly at the door through which Bianca had left the kitchen. This noise was the opening of another door, but it was a very soft and cautious opening. Crystal turned all the way around and watched it. First came the fingers of a brown hand, one of them banded by a ring with a huge jewel in a gaudy setting. Then the arm appeared. It was an arm dressed in a very tight black velvet sleeve that ended in a point halfway down the back of the hand. Crystal stood staring. What next? A head and shoulders, though it was a boy's head and shoulders. Paul's, in fact. It was surprising enough, for a black fillet circled the brows, and a cape of black velvet, lined with royal purple, and clasped with a sparkling buckle at one shoulder. The eyes of the apparition met Crystal's, but before it moved or spoke, it turned its glance to take in every inch of the kitchen. Paul was looking for Bianca. When he saw she was not there, he opened the door farther and stepped in. "It's only you," were his first words, and very relieved words. "Where's Bianca?" "Gone for Hebe. She'll be back any minute, though," Crystal warned him. The cape, now that she saw him whole, trailed the kitchen floor at one corner. Under it he wore a sort of tunic, belted with a wide silver chain belt. Black tights and red, very pointed Persian leather slippers completed the costume. "I just want to get some cookies," he explained, hurriedly. "She is such a pig about her cookies." He went past Crystal and into the pantry. Crystal had to laugh. Hamlet stealing cookies. He came back with half a dozen. "Possibly you wouldn't think it so comical," he accused her with dignity, "if you had such a cook to depend on yourself. A fellow starves." That would suit Hamlet, wouldn't it? Starving. He was halfway through the door, but he turned and came in again, keeping his hand on the knob, however, for safety. "How'd you know I was Hamlet?" he asked, a little self-consciously. Who could help knowing? Crystal looked at his clothes. He dropped his eyes to them. "Oh, I'd forgotten I had 'em on," he exclaimed, taken aback. "But just the same, there's nothing to laugh at." "I didn't mean to laugh." Crystal was far from laughter now. In fact, she was looking at Paul with fascinated interest. "Are you an actor?" she asked. "Well, not yet," he answered her seriously. "But I may be. If it's not acting, it will be dramaturgy, and that's bigger, of course. That's what my father is, a dramaturge. All morning I've been reading Hamlet, up in my room, out loud, you know, walking around. It's better when you're doing that to dress up. You feel it more." He was taking her quite into his confidence, but he was justified in that. Her next words proved it. "I do that myself," she said, "but nobody knows it, just in my room, and it's always Shakespeare. Once I saw Hampden play Hamlet in Boston. Have you seen him in Hamlet or anything?" "You bet. 7 times in Hamlet alone, and Forbes Robertson too. But say, aren't you the Larkspur girl? What are you doing here?" "Waiting for Hebe. Bianca's gone for her. I told you." A queer change came into Paul's face. She couldn't understand it. "It's funny you're chasing Hebe up so," he said. Crystal flushed. "I don't chase her up," she denied. "I've seen her only twice before, the day she came, and the next day. More'n a week ago, when we took a walk. Today I have something I must tell her. Something's come up." She was justifying herself to herself for intruding on Hebe without being invited, as much as to Paul, but the queer expression did not leave his face. "Do you like her?" he asked, with the expression intensifying. But before Crystal could answer, they heard a step, and Paul vanished. It was Bianca come back, and alone. "Hebe's not in her room," she said. "Thought she was. She is looking for you, though. Down at your house, it may be. She wanted you, but I did not know she had started." Blissful words. Crystal thanked Bianca and hurried away. Paul was waiting for her at the side of the steps, under the shaded kitchen windows. "Wouldn't she see you?" he asked, with eager curiosity. "She is looking for me," Crystal told him, in as nonchalant a tone as she could manage, in her elation. "Bianca said she wanted to see me, and perhaps was already at my house." Paul whistled, but he kept Crystal from hurrying on. "Did Bianca really say that?" he asked, as though he doubted it. "But tell me, which play do you like best? Of Shakespeare, I mean." At any other time, Crystal would have delighted in an opportunity to talk Shakespeare and acting with another person who was as interested as herself. But now, of course, she was all impatience to get home. Romeo and Juliet. She did not have to stop to think. She knew so well. Then The Winter's Tale. Then The Tempest, I guess. Unless that comes first. Then Midsummer Night's Dream. But Paul, halfway through her recitation, had lost interest. He was looking off over her head into a tall lilac bush a few yards away. Before she had quite reached Midsummer Night's Dream in her recital, he said, "Shh, shh, there's yes, I do believe." He hurried forward on his Persian leather toes, forgetting to wind his cape about him, stealing over the grass. Below his breath, but more to himself than to her, she heard him murmur, "A prairie warbler, as I'm alive. Oh, what luck!" With Crystal, the confusing little warblers were an old story. To Paul, however, coming from California and expecting to be too late for their migration, this glimpse of one scarce species was very great luck indeed. Crystal did not linger to share in his exulting. She walked very fast around the house, bravely around to the front this time, and out down the drive. She did not care now whether she met Hilda and Agnes and Esther or not, or whether they saw her. Hebe had actually gone to Tinklebell in search of her. Everything else faded out in the light of that. In the village, and not far from home, she was overtaken by Alexander Coldwater. He came up from behind and matched his steps to her hurrying ones, before she had heard or realized him. He was hatless, and again in white flannels. On the view she had not appreciated what a very special person he was. There his narrow, high head, with its crisp, dark curls, his skin turned copper by the sun, his intense, smoky blue eyes, the classical proportions of his body, had been no more remarkable than the gleam of the white birches, or the summer haze wrapping the mountain range. It all belonged, and was merely a continuation of the harmony. But here, on the village street, on a Tuesday morning, it was different. Cristel saw him for the first time, and they were much observed, people chancing to look out of windows, people passing in autos, and the few they met on the sidewalk. Everyone knew who the unusual-looking youth was, Alexander Coldwater, the adored and probably spoiled grandson of Madame Coldwater, just graduated from Harvard, staying for a few weeks at Blue Diamond, before joining his father, the portrait painter, Maurice Coldwater, in Italy, where he would study with him. Cristel was uncomfortably conscious of the way everyone stared, but Alexander was pleasantly unaware. "I've been looking for you and your friend Hebe up on the view," he said. "It's been ages. I didn't quite dare approach Hebe herself, but I thought, perhaps, you wouldn't mind my coming to Tingle Bell to see you about it. Do you?" Cristel shook her head. She didn't mind. She was very glad. And then, of course, she remembered Selina. What would Selina say to her walking in with Alexander? Ought Cristel to explain to him how Selina felt about their knowing each other? Selina herself hadn't explained to Cristel not a word, but really it was only having the portrait painted she had seemed to mind, and her meeting him with Hebe on the view. Perhaps to Alexander himself Selina had no objection, but that was to be discovered immediately, for here they were. "Well, this is luck. Here's the lady herself," Alexander exclaimed as they turned in at Tingle Bell's Walk. They had both seen her at the same instant, in the arbor. She was turned away from them, sitting on the low bench, in the shade of the vines, her head tipped back against the trellis, her silvery straw hat on her knees. The poise of her body told them it was Hebe before they had time to take in other details. Selina was facing her and them, sitting erect in the light and shade of the honeysuckle, so absorbed in what Hebe was saying that she did not notice Cristel and her companion until they stood in the doorway of the arbor. When she raised her eyes then and saw them, she paled a little. Cristel greeted Hebe, and then introduced Alexander to Selina. He, for his part, was staring at Selina as at a ghost. What was the matter? It was only the briefest instant. Then they both bowed, acknowledging the introduction casually enough. Hebe rose. "I've been waiting for you, Cristel," she said. "Miss Barker has been very kind, and let me talk to her, though." She turned to Alexander. "I thought we might go and look you up, but it has grown so warm I don't believe it's the morning for that long climb, and a sitting after all. The picture will have to wait again, but don't give us up. Now was Selina's opportunity to explain that Crystal might not go on with the sittings, yet she remained silent. Did she expect Crystal herself to say it? Crystal couldn't. She remained silent too. Alexander said to Hebe, "I don't mean to nag you about it, or even urge. Of course, you know that, but I am awfully keen about getting along with it. You understand?" Hebe nodded. "Yes, I do, only it must be a little cooler, and I have been resting lately." She looked rather frail as she spoke, and the wide hat, which she had put on now, cast the pearly shadow across her face. The three people gazing at her felt that they wanted to be careful of her. For the moment she seemed too light and fragile for the world, but when she moved toward the door of the arbor, the illusion was dispelled. A weary person does not move with such grace. If she had been tired and needed rest, it was as a child gets tired and needs rest. They followed her. Crystal wanted to go with her, in spite of her caller, Alexander. Hebe sensed this and said, "Soon, Crystal, I'll see you again. Not now." Alexander had not heard, and he offered himself. "May I walk back with you? It's on my way, you know." Hebe shook her head. "No, thank you. I'd rather go alone." She nodded a goodbye to Selina, with the slight up-tilting of her lips in the delicate smile, and went away out the flagged walk to the street. Crystal and Alexander and Selina were left together. Now Selina surely must say something. It hadn't been fair letting Hebe go away thinking Crystal could still go up Long Hill for the picture some cool day soon. But her departure had followed so instantly on their arrival. Perhaps Selina hadn't had time to think it through. She must now, though, with Alexander. They stood together in the hot sunlight, all three a little hesitant and undecided as to the next thing to do. Then Selina said, "I've something I must attend to inside. Come in soon, Crystal." With a brief nod to Alexander, she turned away. Alexander looked after her meditatively. His eyes narrowed. When Crystal spoke, he glanced back at her, as though startled from some dream. "Shan't we go sit in the arbor? It's cooler there." She hoped, of course, he would refuse. She knew very well that Selina did not want him to stay, and did not approve of his being here at all. Selina had made that perfectly evident, but what was she to do? Certainly Selina had not helped her any, and Hebe had gone away like that with almost no word to her. Her throat felt thick and tight. Alexander realized her trouble, perhaps, for after a second's delay, during which he looked as though he wanted to accept her invitation, he said, suddenly, "No, perhaps not. Your sister said she'd need you soon, or something like that. I'll go along. Only do come soon, won't you? I don't dare pester your friend Hebe about it, but you jog her up, won't you?" Crystal looked at him. "You see," she began, but then she gave it up. "Goodbye," she said, and held out her hand. He backed down the very short path, still urging Crystal to come soon to the view, and almost into Miss Grant, who was just passing on the sidewalk. She looked her extreme surprise to see him there, apparently on such intimate terms with Crystal. She almost caught him by the coat, or so it seemed to Crystal, in her eagerness to hold him from going on. They stood talking. Of course Miss Grant, the one person in Fairfleet who could be said to know Miss Coldwater, or was ever invited to Blue Diamond beyond the famous annual party, would know Alexander. She turned from the direction in which she had been going, and paced slowly beside him, as he held back his long stride. Crystal went into the house. Inside the screen door she stopped, surprised. On the lowest step of the staircase sat Selina, looking dazed. Such an odd place to find Selina, that lowly, undignified bottom stair in the hall's dusk. She looked up at Crystal with a peculiar smile. "Who is that Hebe of yours, anyway?" she asked. Crystal had no answer to that except Bianca Falgana's, the housekeeper's friend. But Selina knew that already, so she said nothing. Selina did not expect an answer. "She's bewitched me, I think, whoever she is. But she is lovely, Crystal. No wonder you like her so much." "Oh, I'm so glad you see it too." "Of course I see it. But she's older than you thought, I'm sure. She's older than I am. Why, she might almost be 30. Crystal laughed. "Oh no, she couldn't be 30. To Crystal, 30 was the beginning of old age. What makes you think anything so impossible? Her wisdom, the way she is, my dear, not the way she looks. And she makes people do what she says. No one, anywhere, near my age could have affected me so." "What has she made you do?" Crystal sat down on the narrow stair beside Selina. It was jolly having Selina so undignified as this for once, though Crystal did admire her dignity. But this was being chums. "About that picture. You're to go on with it. Alexander Coldwater may finish it." "Oh, Selina." It was all that Crystal could say, but she leaned against her sister, pressing her shoulder. "Yes, because of Hebe. But I'd like to know more about her, even her last name. Or is Hebe her last name? Is she Miss Hebe, perhaps? I told her everything. Can you imagine that? The things I haven't told anyone, even you. But I don't care. I'm not a bit worried. They are safe. And she was so sensible. She agreed with me, though, that you oughtn't to see much of Alexander after she knew about things. But she thought it wouldn't be fair not to let him finish the picture. After all, the reason has nothing to do with him, the reason for my not wanting you to go on. And she said a few more sittings would finish it. Only, Crystal, he can't come here as he did this morning. There is a reason why we can't be friends, like that with him. But I may go up to Long Hill with Hebe for the picture. You won't change about that?" "Yes, only a few times, though, till it's done, and only because I think Hebe would be so right about anything. I'm awfully young, really, Crystal. People don't remember that, and I don't either often, but I am. Hebe made me feel how dreadfully young I am." A step on the flags outside drew their attention. It was Miss Grant, almost at the door stone. She's come to find out why Alexander was here," Selina whispered, with an unusual gleam of mischief. "Let's not tell her anything about the picture at all, just for fun. You haven't already, have you, Crystal?"